How do you create a just society? Even if you appoint judges who are honest and fair and who will apply the laws fairly to everyone, you still have to decide what are the laws that will define right and wrong in your society. Now, some people think the way to ensure truly just societies is to start over from scratch. You need a revolution. It's the only way to clean out the baggage and the privilege and everything else. Think the French Revolution, right? Everything starts from scratch. The Bolshevik Revolution, everything starts from scratch. Even the American Revolution, we're breaking with Britain, we're creating our own constitution and laws and judicial systems and everything else. That way, we will have, in some ways, a recreation of the Enlightenment idea of a state of nature. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote about this concept that human beings lived as individuals in nature at one point, and then they somehow managed to come up with laws and rules that would preserve their rights and their security in a collective, in a group, in a society. So a revolution is a kind of new state of nature where the book is wiped clean and we can start from scratch, and this time we'll do it right. At least that's the claim. Now, on the other hand, if you're dubious about revolutions, and to be honest, many revolutions have not carried through on that promise to create the perfect society afterwards. I sometimes will say that the guillotines are very hungry when you commit a revolution. Others think that the better way, the more reliable path to a more just society, is instead gradual change of existing laws, a kind of evolution. After all, even the American Revolution was based on the rights of Englishmen and Enlightenment ideas. They didn't come up with everything from scratch. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal did not revolutionize American society in an overthrow revolution, even though he cannibalized large parts of the Socialist Party's platform with Social Security and rights to organize and all kinds of other social service and welfare initiatives, universal employment through the Civilian Conservation Corps, and more and more. These were all socialist ideas that Roosevelt adopted in some ways to preempt revolution through a kind of gradual change. Or you might think of President Barack Obama's wonderful phrase, a still more perfect union, right? That the goal is that we're not perfect, but we're getting better, and we can get still better if we work on it. Now, when humanistic Jews study the laws of the Torah, we are generally not taking notes for what kind of new laws we want to pass today. There are people that do that, by the way, but they are not us. When we look back at Torah laws, we're looking at what the authors of the text envisioned would be an ideal society, the ideal society that they wanted. Now, they sort of played puppet master and put these laws into God's mouth, but it was still people who wrote it. So we don't have to be allergic to the fact that it says God says so-and-so because a person wrote that God said so-and-so. So it's still a person who is the author behind the voice. And the law-giving moment in the Torah's narrative, the Sinai revelation, is described as a revolution. You see, the Hebrews have come from slavery. They have no sense of running their own affairs. They go out into the middle of the desert, so they're all by themselves. They receive divine commandments coming from the sky, written on magic tablets. They're literally starting over from scratch. Before they own any territory, before they have any government, it's like the state of nature plus, plus, plus. Except, if you actually know the history behind the writing of the Torah text, we know that the authors were writing after the formation of Hebrew kingdoms. They were writing in the 700s, 600s BCE instead of in the desert in the 1200s, as the narrative imagines. And they were writing after there were Hebrew kingdoms in place. Some of the laws were written after those kingdoms had been destroyed. So we'd had sovereignty and then lost it, and then we're trying to regain it again. And we also know from archaeology that Jewish people did not invent law or justice. There's all kinds of laws in the ancient Near East that were promulgated by different kingdoms and different kings. The most famous might be the law code of Hammurabi, which was written in the 1700s BCE, so almost 1,000 years before the Torah itself was likely beginning to be written. So, what we have in the Torah is a claimed revolution that's actually an evolution that claims to have been radically revising everything, but sometimes it was drawing from other sources and sometimes it was confirming the established order. Now, when we look back at Torah laws, we want to have what I call a mature relationship with those laws. When you're 5 years old, you think your parents know everything. And when you're 15 years old, you're convinced that your parents know absolutely nothing. And by the time you get to maybe 25, maybe 35 years old, you realize your parents knew some things and they failed at other things. They were people. They did the best with what they could do. And so you're allowed in your own adulthood to make your own choices of what speaks to you and what you might choose to do differently. That's how we approach these laws. They were written by people. Some of these laws are great, some of them are okay, some of them are terrible. They're both time bound and timeless examples. So, the Torah passage we're going to be looking at today is called Mishpatim, which means judgments, and it takes place immediately after the Exodus from Egypt and the journey to Mount Sinai. In Exodus chapter 20, we saw the national revelation of the Ten Commandments with thunder and fire and tremendously powerful voice, and it was too terrifying for the people. And they say to Moses, "We can't handle any more of this. You go up to the mountain, you talk to God. We don't want to be a part of it because it's too much for us." And so that's where this Torah passage begins in Exodus chapter 21. Mishpatim. These are the rules, the Mishpatim, the judgments you set before them. Now, the first set of laws that it's giving after having given the Ten Commandments are all about slavery. Now, there's a real irony there, isn't there? Because where had they just come from? They just escaped from being slaves. And you would think the only rule about slavery is don't have slaves. But no, this is accommodating the reality of slavery in the ancient world. And in some ways, we'll see this slavery is actually a little bit more progressive than some other texts. In other ways, it's as bad or even worse. There's a meme that sometimes makes the round on social media. There's a picture of supposedly a god, and it says, God had the chance to ban two things in the Revelation. He could have banned slavery or shellfish, and he banned shellfish with the dietary laws. Well, again, we'll see how the Torah approaches this question of slavery. Is it an improvement or is it only so-so? So, verse 2, it says, when you acquire a Hebrew slave, that person will serve for 6 years. I mean, already you say, wait a minute. You, a Hebrew, acquires a Hebrew slave? What are we doing enslaving each other? We just got out of slavery. I thought we learned the lesson. Well, rabbinic commentary will often present this as it's a gradual process. We got to sort of train them into this new world. So here's an example of bridging them into not having Hebrew slaves. The person who is the slave serves you for 6 years and then goes free in the 7th year without payment. You don't have to ransom them. It's just automatic. If the slave came single, he leaves single. If he had a wife, the wife goes out with him. Now, that's if he brought a wife in as the servant for that period of time. And you have to decide, is Eved in the Hebrew, is that servant, is that slave? It's the same word as Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves, that we sing at Passover, so I think it's reasonable to translate it as slave here. So that's if he came in with a wife. He gets to leave with a wife. But if his master gave him a wife and she has borne him children, the wife and the children belong to the master, and he leaves by himself. Who's the property here? Well, the wife remains the property of the master, not of the husband. But if the slave instead declares, I love my master. How many slaves did that? I love my master and my wife and children. I do not want to go free. Because you have hostages, right? You've got my wife and child that you're not letting go. By the way, they don't seem to get freed in that seventh year either. It's not listed there. So if the slave submits to blackmail and decides he wants to stay with his wife and children, then the master will take him before God, which is really interesting in itself. You take him to the God. He will be brought to the door or the doorpost. His master will pierce his ear with an awl, sort of create a mark on him. And he shall then remain his master's slave le'olam, forever. No 7 year parole. You're a permanent slave because you refuse to leave behind your wife and child. Well, we should be appalled by this, right? Now, is this an improvement because it does have some prospect of freedom? Minimally. I don't give this a lot of bonus points. Now notice the next category of slave law, verse 7. When a parent sells a daughter as a slave, she shall not go free as other slaves do. So she has to stay there. So the man who becomes a slave on his own volition, or obviously out of necessity, gets to go free in year 7, but the daughters that are sold as slaves, again, the prospect of selling your daughter as a slave, terrible. But they have to stay forever. But, again, here's a qualification. If she proves to be displeasing to her master, literally it says, Im ra'a b'einei adoneha, if she is bad or evil or wicked or just not good in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, who wanted to marry her himself, really, he must let her be redeemed. She gets to be ransomed off. He does not have the right to sell her to outsiders, since he broke faith with her, because he had bought her, intending her for himself. He decided he doesn't like her. Well, he can't just sell her off to anybody. She's allowed to be redeemed by her own people to stay within the Hebrew community. And if the master designated her for his son, and then again he decides he doesn't like her, he will deal with her as is the practice with free maidens. So she is now free, or she's treated at least as would be the case for a betrothed woman who is then rejected. And if he does take another into the household as his wife, let's say he does marry the slave that he bought for that purpose, or cohabit with the slave, if we don't want to give it the dignity of marriage in that kind of an unequal power dynamic. If he does cohabit with her and then takes another woman to be with him, he is not allowed to disparage or disparately mistreat the slave woman that was the first partner for him. He has to provide her with her food and her clothing and her, it says, conjugal rights, or her ointments, or her perks, we'll call it that way. And if he fails her in these 3 ways, she gets to go free. Ein kesef, no money, without payment. So again, here are some possibilities for allowing the female slave to go free, but within the context of a system that is clearly unequal, allowing polygamy, allowing the purchase of people's children. I mean, we don't have to say this is great. We can say it's pretty bad. Now, the topic changes in the very next verse, because now we're turning to a category of law that's often called torts, T-O-R-T-S. And it doesn't mean torts as in like cakes that are yummy. This is the damages. What happens if this person gets hurt doing this or the other? What if you cause damage to somebody? It could be damage to the point of death, or it could be damage to property or other things, as we'll see. So we begin with the extreme case of damages, and that is killing someone else. Remember, we just saw in chapter 20 of Exodus, Lo tirtzach, you shall not murder. Clarify that in the Ten Commandments translation, it's often presented, thou shalt not kill. But literally in the Hebrew, it means thou shalt not murder. You can't commit illegal killing, but other kinds of killing may be treated differently. So here we have, in fact, some examples of other kinds of killings. Initially, it says, Makeh ish, someone who hits a man, v'met, and he dies, mot yumat. That person will surely be put to death. So if you kill someone on purpose, you're going to be put to death. That's death penalty for that. But, verse 13, If a man did it, but not by design, he didn't plan it. Elohim, the gods or God did it. Well, then I'll tell you a place that he can flee and live. It's like a city of refuge, as is described later in the Torah. It's like exile that they can go to, but you don't kill them because it wasn't really their fault. God caused it, but it wasn't their fault. When one party schemes against another and kills through treachery, you'll take that person from my very altar to be put to death. So sometimes the altar could be a sanctuary, a place to flee. No sanctuary. So it goes from the opposite of a sanctuary city for an accidental death to even the sanctuary of God is no safety if you plotted and betrayed someone to be able to kill them. One who strikes their mother or father shall be put to death. I wish I'd known that as a parent. Well, I probably wouldn't have enforced it. One who kidnaps another party, whether having sold or still holding the victim, shall be put to death. This has sad resonance these days, doesn't it? That question of kidnapping and hostages and what's to be done. Well, in this case, it says even if you sold the person into slavery somewhere else, you're still responsible because you robbed them of their freedom and to some extent of themselves. One who curses or insults his father and mother should be put to death. Wouldn't that have been useful to deploy as a parent? Well, again, probably not to the extreme. And so now we get into other circumstances. These things happened. There's no ambiguity. We're going to enforce the law. But verse 18 begins to introduce doubt and delay. What happens? When two parties quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or a fist, and the victim does not die, lo yamut, he does not die, v'nafal lemishkav, he falls down and lies down. He has to stay on his bed, right? So he's incapacitated for a period of time. If the victim then gets up and walks outdoors on a staff, the attacker goes unpunished, except for paying for the idleness and the cure. Okay? So you have to pay for lost wages, right? Person wasn't able to work, so you owe them some money. And if it costs anything to cure them, you've got to pay for the repair, the fix, the medicine. But this is an example of damages. You've done damage. You have to pay to repair the damage, but you didn't kill them. They were just temporarily delayed, and therefore it's a damages case, not a murder case. What about if the fight is between a person who owns the slave and his own slave? Do you have the power of life and death over them? Well, in verse 20 it says, when a slave owning party, so here in the Hebrew, v'chi yakeh ish et avdo, if a man strikes his slave, so he's the owner, o amato, or his female slave, b'shevet, with a rod or a staff, v'met tachat yado, and he dies under his hand right away, like bam, dead. Nakom yanakem, this will surely be avenged. So goes back to that verse. It says a man who kills a man will be put to death. So slaves still count as people, as opposed to just property that you could kill at your own whim. But if the victim survives a day or two, this is not to be avenged, since the one is the other's property. Well, all that wonderful points you got for treating slaves as people, you just lost. Because now, if you strike them and it takes a couple days for them to die, now you get off scot-free. Because you had the right to do it. There's no penalty for hitting them in the first place. I just did a review of a book called Caste, which talked about the American system of slavery as well as racism. And she described the plantations as torture centers, as internment camps, as concentration camps. She described the beating of slaves as torture. And it was. That was the whole point. was to cause them pain, to stop them doing things, or to make them do things. It was a kind of torture. And that's exactly what's being described here. And as long as you don't kill them right away, you can get off with no penalty. So now we move back to conflicts between free people. And again, you see it jumps back and forth. This circumstance as it applies to free people, and then how it applies to slaves. Here now, 22. When two people fight, and one of them pushes a pregnant woman, and a miscarriage results, v'yatsa yaldeha, so her child comes out, it's a miscarriage, but no other damage occurs, then the responsible person, the one who did the pushing, will be fined according to the woman's husband may exact, the payment to be based on some kind of calculation. And the footnote here says, as the judges determine. So it depends on how you interpret it. But basically, the idea is that there's a fine. Now, notice here, a miscarriage is not a murder. There's a fine, there's a penalty, but it doesn't mean you killed some being that was a full person. You can see how that might apply to contemporary issues. However, if other damage ensues, what could the other damage be? Well, it could be the death of that pregnant wife, right? A miscarriage late in pregnancy, if the child obstructs the birth canal and the woman is bleeding, I mean, it could be death for both. So if there is other damage that ensues, and here we get the famous phrase, nefesh tachat nefesh, life for life, literally soul for soul, ayin tachat ayin, eye for eye, shin tachat shin, tooth for tooth, yad tachat yad, hand for hand, and foot for foot, regel tachat regel. And then even more, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. This is in fancy language called lex talionis, the law of keeping it even. You cause this pain, you feel that pain. You poke out an eye, you lose an eye. You cut off a hand, your hand is cut off. Now, what's remarkable about this passage is that in rabbinic law, when they interpreted these laws, they said this obviously means monetary compensation. Now, when I read it, it sounds like it's eye for eye, tooth for tooth, one for one. But their reading of it is that it must refer to monetary compensation because this kind of a system is impossible to enforce evenly. How do I give you the exact same bruise that you gave me? How do I burn you exactly the same as you burned me? It's impossible. And is it really fair, let's say, in the eye for eye category? What if a person with one eye puts out someone else's eye that had two? So now you're going to take the person with one eye and take out their other eye so they're blind? That's not comparable to having only one eye lost. So the rabbis spin back the wheel to the earlier passage that talks about if the person gets up and walks outdoors, then you have to pay for things. So the rabbis themselves come up with different categories of paying for physical damage you do to another person in a conflict. You have to pay for the lost wages, the idleness we saw before. You have to pay for the healing, the cure, any expenses involved in medical care. You have to pay for the pain that they suffered. That's also part of your reckoning. And finally, they have this category they call loss of value, which means if you had been a slave with two eyes and then you became a slave with one eye, what would your loss of value be in the market? Well, that's an amount of a fine that the person has to pay to make up for what you lost. So you got a tooth knocked out. What would a slave with one less tooth cost on the market? That's the price of a tooth. I mean, you might say this is ridiculous, but there are all kinds of expense calculations for injury and death. If you look at any insurance policy for travel insurance, they're enumerating what happens if X, Y, and Z takes place. There's a whole field of legal arrangements when there's mass disasters that they try to calculate what the worth of a life is or the worth of the loss of this versus something else in the in the sort of fair compensation from the pool of money that's produced. So this torts law continues even today. Again, we might find it a little primitive to say that we're going to take out an eye for something, but it does reflect certainly the time and place that these laws were being made. Of course, that was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth for full people. We have to look at the other circumstance in verse 25. What about a slave? If a slave owning party strikes the eye of a slave, male or female, and destroys it, you might think the answer is no problem, it's their slave. Wrong. In this case, it says, that person shall let the slave go free on account of the eye. If the owner knocks out a tooth of a slave, male or female, that person lets the slave go free on account of the tooth. So there is some right. The slave does not stop being a human being in every capacity, it's only in some capacities. So now we have another category. And this is the category of what if your animal does something? After all, this is an agricultural society. You've got horses and cows and dogs and oxen. And oxen have horns, and sometimes those horns are dangerous. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox will be stoned, its flesh will not be eaten, but the owner of the ox is not to be punished. You know, an ox gets loose and it runs over somebody. It's not your fault. The ox did it, so the ox pays. But an ox has been in the habit of goring. He was a gorer, and everybody knew it. And the owner, even though warned, was negligent. He failed to guard it. And then that dangerous animal killed a person, a man or a woman. Then the ox will be stoned, and the owner too shall be put to death because they are responsible for the death of others, even by animal. So if you had a dog that was known to maul or attack children and it kills a child, you would be liable for what the dog did. It's not just the dog that gets destroyed. In this case, the owner would be killed too because they killed someone. We might fine them, imprison them, whatever, but there's still some consequence, even if it's your animal that does the action. And then we have another category of damages. If a ransom is imposed, the owner must pay whatever is imposed to redeem the owner's own life. And so too, if the animal gores a minor, male or female, its owner shall be dealt with according to the same rule. So sometimes there's a fine that could be levied instead. And again, it's interesting that they are differentiating the death of a minor from the death of a full person. But, and then again, we have that category of slaves. If the ox gores a slave, male or female, well, here, the slave is not a full person. Its owner will pay 30 shekels of silver to the master, and the ox will be stoned. So the ox still gets destroyed, but the owner now has a fine, not payable to the slave's family, but payable to the master because he lost some property. And it doesn't even have to be an animal. It could be, you know, a danger along the road or on your property. When any party opens a pit or any party digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or an ass falls into it, all right, so you see the circumstance, right? You dug this pit and then you left it open. You didn't put some boards on top of it. Or, you know, the road repair crew doesn't cover up that part of the road and something falls into it. The one responsible for the pit must make restitution, pay the price to the owner, but they get to keep the dead animal, you know, use the carcass or whatever. When a party's ox injures a neighbor's ox, so now it's not even hitting people, it's animals hitting animals. What do we do with that? They sell the live ox and divide the price and divide the dead animal, so they split up the value. You can't keep that ox that gores. If, however, it is known that the ox was a gorer, it was in the habit of goring, and the owner didn't guard it, well, then you have to restore ox for ox. So eye for eye and ox for ox. But you get to keep the dead animal for yourself that your ox gored. And if any party steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters or sells it, then they have to pay back a penalty fine. 5 oxen for the ox, 4 sheep for the sheep. So you get a flavor of this tort law of damages, where animals are on one level and slaves are on another level, and then people are on a different level. Full people, at least. And slaves are sometimes full people and sometimes not. This does treat the slaves as some consideration, but not full consideration, and certainly not full autonomy, especially if they've made that choice to be slaves forever just because they didn't want to leave their spouse and their children behind. So I want to stop there for a second and ask if anyone had any thoughts or reactions to these laws, thinking of the echoes of these laws in later history and jurisprudence, the resonance with issues from obviously American slavery to the death penalty and capital punishment or corporal punishment, but also liability law, product liability law, and um, the fact that we have the whole insurance industry, for good or for bad, to try to address some of these concerns. So, any thoughts or any parts particularly jump out at you as either interesting or problematic?
In workers' comp law, a part of a body part, a loss of a hand, is a percentage of disability. Um, so that is still definitely reflected in workers' comp law.
Absolutely.
And females still get a little bit short shrifted.
That's correct. That's correct.
And I'm working on some vaccine studies, and we're in Africa and in Uganda. It's still this would still apply basically, where husbands have to agree for the wife or informed consent, and it's just like this. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's good that our society has evolved, but it's sad that there are societies that still reflect this, and this is part of our roots. We can't just pretend it isn't there. This is one of the reasons why I sometimes refer to these passages as they're the skeletons in our closet. Uh, we don't want to say they don't exist. We don't want to say they're wonderful because they're not, but we have to find some way to grapple with it.
I have very mixed reactions every time I see this and I read this because on the one hand, yeah, an eye for an eye always seems such a uh, grotesque idea, at least for us. And on the other hand, some people might argue, well, it's a way to ensure that you don't go overboard, uh, you know, demanding death because of a hand or something like that.
Hmm.
Uh, but I was right now remembering that I come from Venezuela, and some of the indigenous cultures have a very elaborate set of they bargain whenever there has been they have like clans, and whenever a person from one clan has done any kind of damage to a person of another clan, they have this negotiations with where you know how they're going to compensate that. How many goats and
Right.
whatever are you going to pay because of the damage being done? And it's so serious that the local police, the non-native police, they know they have to take that into account whenever something comes up in those regions.
Right.
So um,
Well, I'll also
it,
mention that one of the advances of this passage from the laws of Hammurabi is that there's no differentiation of a noble person versus a peasant. That
okay.
if once you're a full person, you're a full person. But the slaves are still there, and the laws of Hammurabi had slave-based laws too. But if like a serf class, a peasant class, caused damage to a noble class, there were much more rigorous and painful consequences, and the noble could get away with things against the peasant class. Where this law, at least once you're out of slavery, you're all on the same level, and there's no sort of high-low class in that designation of the law. So again, that's one of but people are trying to make it sound better or trying to defend it. They'll highlight that equality under the law. So Jessica and then Kate.
you've said that this is we've evolved and this is still skeletons in our closet, but then you were just talking about the Hammurabi, about the nobles versus the peasants. But would I would rather have this than no consequences. And kind of where we have come to now, which you can see every day on the news, is that the wealthy do get away with a lot more now. We've gone way overboard on that, or on just in the political correctness where there is no consequence because there's always an excuse. So it's sort of like, you
So
know,
hold on to that. We're
or
gonna
one way. Okay.
hold on to that idea. There's a later passage that's going to be directly on that subject.
Okay.
Kate, go ahead.
This is kind of a left turn a little bit, but I was thinking that the first part of the passage was kind of incentivizing the masters assigning wives to their male slaves and like getting them to like hopefully fall in love and have kids, and then they get slaves for life if they don't want to leave. And it's like, wow, security in the system. And like, I just, that kind of struck me as like, that's not cool or okay.
Well, and it's also a kind of chattel slavery because the child doesn't
Mhm.
go free. It's a
Right,
lifetime slavery for the child and for the wife for that matter. It said that you buy a daughter, they don't get to go free on the seventh year like the other ones do. So
right.
there's definitely some problems. Later on, the law will differentiate between a Hebrew slave and a Canaanite slave. And the Canaanite
Mhm.
slaves are for life, but the Hebrew
Canaanite.
slaves get to go free. So it's trying to be more inclusive on the Hebrew side, but it's still differentiating the outsider and the insider, and some get to go free and some are slaves for life. So any system of slavery is bad. Any system of slavery for life is worse. Like we don't have to get into the what is a better model of slavery. They're all bad. Let's just start from that point. All right, well, let's jump on to the next chapter here. This goes into chapter 24. We're not going to be able to go through everything, obviously, but I do want to take a look at a couple sections in chapter 22. So this is more law about damages, but now we're talking at least as much about property damage as anything else, or the risk of property damage. So it begins with the example of a thief who is tunneling under a wall. Like they're tunneling into your house, they're tunneling into the barn, they're going to steal something. And if they are struck and they die, there's no penalty. If somebody comes in your house at night, you don't know what they're there for. Are they just coming to steal your TV or are they coming to kill you? Well, if you strike them, what is that? The head of the castle. I forget the phrase in law. It's some version of stand your ground. But if somebody comes into your house, then they are at risk of what you do. If the sun has risen, then there is some blood guilt in that case, and the thief must make restitution. That means if they live into the like you hit them and they're laid out, and they make it to the morning, well, then there may be some blood guilt involved. The thief has to make restitution for the conflict, and if lacking the means, can even be sold to make up for the damage done by the digging. But if what was stolen, the ox or an ass or a sheaf, is found alive and in hand, then they have to pay double. The fine for stealing is even more. Now, when a party owns livestock and lets it loose to graze in another's land, and so allows a field or a vineyard to be grazed bare, restitution must be made for the impairment of the field or vineyard. This is the classic battle between the settled farmer with fields and vineyards and the nomadic pastoral shepherd who has flocks that wander. You remember the musical Oklahoma? And the song, "Oh, the cowman and the farmer should be friends," but they're not because they're inherently at odds with each other. And this is exactly the circumstance. You've got a flock and you're careless and you let them go graze in the wheat field. Well, you got to make restitution. You owe it. This is again not nobody's died, but it's property damage, and there has to be some kind of system to enforce property damage. So, people sometimes say that property rights are not as important as physical rights, but they're a key part of law for making society function well. The whole concept of private property is very, very historic and deeply rooted in human beings' behavior. You ever put two kids together in front of one toy, you hear that word, mine. Well, that's part of who we are. So we can learn to share. We can do that better. But the concept of mine and yours, that goes back a long time. So this is simply creating order in society by having some kind of legal process if damage is done. And again, it's by animals, but it was the carelessness of the shepherd that allowed it to happen. So they have some responsibility. If you start a fire and then it spreads to thorns and then growing grain is consumed by the fire, well, the person who started the fire must make some restitution. So again, you started the fire spread, you're responsible if you don't keep an eye on your fire. If someone gives someone money or goods to hold for safekeeping and then they're stolen, well, the thief has to pay back double. But if the thief is not caught, the owner of the house has to swear before God that they didn't steal it, right? Then it's not their fault. Now, if it is misappropriation, where they did take the money and they did take the sheep or the garment or anything else, and then the person who had it stolen from them said, "This is mine," they both have to go before God, and God will decide who is guilty. How? Maybe you roll dice, maybe you talk to the priest or the prophet. Um, there were all kinds of ways of trying to decide the will of the gods. In the ancient worlds, you would put oil on water and look at the shape it took. There's even a field, I remember the name because it's so odd. It's called extispicy. Extispicy is where you talk to the god over a sacrificial animal, and then you kill the animal and examine the shape of certain internal organs. And if there are nodes on the pancreas or there are lumps on the liver or whatever, that's a sign from the gods of what the truth is. So, if you ever get into a property dispute with your neighbor, you could go to the courts, you could go to mediation, or you could ask, maybe we can consult the liver of this goat and see if that will resolve the dispute. When any party gives to another one a donkey or a sheep or an ox or any other animal to guard and it dies or is injured or is carried off with no witnesses. So here's a circumstance, right? I gave you my donkey to watch, and then you came into the barn the next morning and it wasn't there. What happens? Well, an oath before Yahweh will decide between the two of them that one has not laid the property on the other, and the owner must acquiesce. And it was and what we say, even in insurance policies today, it's called acts of God, right? It was an act of God. It wandered away. It's not my fault. And there's no restitution to make. But if the animal was stolen from the guardian, by negligence, then there's some kind of restitution to the owner. If it was torn by beasts, wild animals attack the flock, the guardian brings the animal as evidence. You don't have to replace what was torn by beasts. I mean, that's not your fault. If a party borrows an animal and it dies on its own, or it's injured, that could happen too, right? The owner's not being with it, well, then you owe some restitution. If the owner was with it, then you don't have to pay back. But if it was lent out to someone else, then you do owe some pay. So these are all the circumstances of you lend somebody an animal, what happens to it? Today we might deal with you borrowed my car and then you got it dinged, or you ran over somebody's cat, or all kinds of circumstances that you then have to work out who's liable for what. Now that's all about animals. But verse 15 shifts to women who are not quite animals, but are also some kind of living property, unfortunately, in some of the laws. If a man seduces a virgin, a betulah, for whom the bride price has not yet been paid, and he lies with her, he must make her his wife by payment of the bride price. I know this is maybe a little crude. You break it, you bought it. Right? She was supposed to be married to someone else. The bride price had not been paid yet, so she wasn't like legally obligated to that person, but you use the goods. So now you gotta buy it. There's a Seinfeld episode where George Costanza takes a book into the bathroom, I think, and he's forced to buy it because it's been flagged. He used it in a way that you just can't use it and get away from owning it. So now, what does the woman think about this? Doesn't matter. I mean, this is a world of bride price, right? I mean, it's not caring what she thinks. Now, if her father refuses to give her to him, again, who's the owner here, right? The father is the owner of the daughter. If the father refuses to give her to him, he still must weigh out silver in accordance with the bride price for a virgin. So he still owes the fine, even if the father won't let him take possession of the goods. Again, this is one of those cases where, blech, bride prices and virgins. But now we start talking about other sort of miscellaneous circumstances. A sorceress will not be allowed to live with you. You have to kill them. So that's again in the category, I guess, of mystery women. Whoever lies with an animal will be put to death. No bestiality. That's capital punishment. Whoever sacrifices to a god other than Yahweh will be proscribed. Now, what do all these have in common? They have a kind of infidelity issue. You know, the sleeping with the virgin and the sleeping with an animal and the sacrificing to another god. Sometimes it uses the phrase in Hebrew, you're whoring after other gods. I'm a jealous God, right? So ritual laws, purity laws, and then we get a whole series of really wonderful ethical laws that we would like. You will not wrong or oppress the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Do not ill-treat the widow or the orphan, a vulnerable person. And if you do mistreat them, I, God, will hear their outcry as they cry out to me, and my anger will blast forth against you, and your wives will become widows, and your children will become orphans. I mean, the really poetic symmetry there, right? So here we have this law saying, care for the widow, care for the orphan, don't mistreat them, don't oppress the stranger. You know what it's like. Do better. If you lend money to any people, to the poor among you, don't take interest. You lend them the money, you get the money back. Don't make money on money. If you take your neighbor's garment in a pledge, because they owe you something, you must return it before the sun sets. He needs to have clothing and to sleep. If they cry out to me, I will listen. I am compassionate. I will punish you for being cruel to them. So again, we have concern for the poor, concern for borrowers, concern for the widow and the orphan and the stranger. Now, you don't revile God. You don't curse any of the leaders of your people. You have to have respect. You don't put off skimming the first yield of your vats. That is for sacrifices. The firstborn of the children belong to me. So these are the privileges due to God. And same thing for the flocks as well. So God gets his cut, so to speak. But you have to treat the vulnerable people well, and you have to do what I say in terms of my cut. And chapter 23 continues with some of these wonderful laws. Do not carry false rumors. Do not join hands with the guilty to be a malicious witness. And here's going back to what Jessica was highlighting earlier. You will not side with the mighty to do wrong. You will not give false testimony in a dispute to skew it in favor of the mighty, nor will you show deference to the poor person in a dispute. So you don't automatically assume the poor person is right, and you don't automatically assume the rich person is right, or allow false testimony to support the rich person. So equal justice, fantastic, wonderful, acknowledging privilege and the power of wealth versus poverty. You even have to care for things that belong to your enemy. When you encounter your enemy's ox or its ass, its donkey wandering around, you must return it. Don't say, whoopsie, it's lost, and now it's mine. You have to take it back. If you see the donkey of your enemy lying under a burden, and you want to leave it there, let that donkey die under that heavy burden. No, you help to raise it up. Maybe it's compassion for the animal. Maybe it's respect for the other person. It's not taking unfair advantage. It's being fair. That's the whole point. Try to be fair. Fair for poor and rich, fair for the animals, fair for even your enemy when it comes to an animal out on the road. You do not subvert the rights of the needy in their disputes. Keep far from a false charge. Do not bring death on those who are innocent, because I will not acquit the evildoer. Do not take bribes, because a bribe blinds the clear-sighted, upsets the pleas of those who are in the right. So even the judges have to be honest and not accept money for justice. And again, don't oppress the stranger, because you know what it feels like. You know the soul of the stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I have no objections to any of those laws. These are great. So that's what makes evaluating Torah law so complicated, because you've got the slavery laws that we find so objectionable, and you've got these laws about equal justice and compassion and balance mixed in with condemning sorcerers and worrying about idols. Well, this is one of the complexities of this law, because it is such a mixed bag. So any of those laws jump out at you as either particularly interesting or particularly problematic, maybe in a way that I didn't highlight? Thinking about the those equal treatment laws, the justice laws, how you treat the stranger, and also giving God their cut from the materials, not lending money at interest, not keeping the garment in pledge, not oppressing the widow and the orphan at the risk of your children becoming widows and orphans. So anything of those laws jump out at you?
I had the question, I put it in the chat.
Ah,
It was more of a confusion on one you kind of just glanced on about the firstborn male belonging to God, but is that circumcision? How could it be? Because aren't all males supposed to be circumcised because there's a covenant?
no.
I'm not sure what that meant.
Yeah, I again in the triage of choosing topics, I didn't want to get into the details on it. So um, originally, this concept of the firstborn belonged to God, it could have been a kind of even child sacrifice. There's some speculation that the original version of the Binding of Isaac story is actually a sacrifice where he does sacrifice Isaac, because at the end of the story it says Abraham went back to the young men that were traveling with him. It doesn't say Isaac went back. So maybe in a version of the story it was a sacrifice. And that was a way of saying the firstborn belongs to God. But aside from the fact that it isn't Abraham's firstborn. The second issue is that perhaps at one time the firstborn would work at the sanctuary. They became the priests.
Okay.
And so while you sacrifice the firstborn of the animals, obviously, you didn't sacrifice the firstborn of people. That's unthinkable. So they would be the priests who would work with the sanctuary. However, in later texts, you read that God decides to choose the Levite tribe, and particularly Aaron and his descendants, to be the priests and the temple attendants and the sanctuary attendants. So it's sort of replacing this idea that the firstborn has to work for God or belong to God in some way. However, you still have this law in Exodus. And for people who were raised in a more traditional setting, they might have occasionally heard of a ritual called a Pidyon Haben, which means a redemption of the son. The idea is that if you have a firstborn, and that firstborn is a boy, and actually technically it's the first time that you were ever pregnant, because if you had a miscarriage, it eliminates the possibility of a Pidyon Haben. But if your first pregnancy results in a male child, then you have this ritual where you invite a Kohen, a priest, and you redeem the child by giving the Kohen 5 shekels of silver or something like that, which they then give to charity. And there's a whole ritual that takes place at that ceremony. That's an echo of what happened here in Exodus 23. So it wasn't really a circumcision at the time, but it was, and it may be, by the way, that the circumcision ritual for all male children was a replacement for the original child sacrifice. So instead of sacrificing the whole child, you're just sacrificing a little bit of the child. And it's also connected to a fertility rite, because which part of the child are you sacrificing? Well, it's the part that's very close to fertility function. Okay.
Thank you for taking the deviation to
That's
go
fine.
back.
And thanks for those comments in the chat. When I hide the bottom screen, I can't see the chat, so I didn't see them. For the phrase castle doctrine for the person attacking the home, that's the phrase. And then someone else had asked about how many people wrote this, because it seems like there may have been different sources that contribute to this, different flavors or values. That's I leave that to the philologists and the scholars of the evolution of Hebrew language who can understand sort of the subtleties of which phrasing is used here and there. Again, there's a commentary by Richard Elliott Friedman who wrote the Bible. He also wrote a commentary on the Torah, and he brings a lot of those insights into his detailed commentaries on particular verses. Well, as time is moving on, I want to jump forward to one last part of this Torah portion, and it describes a really fascinating scene. And sadly, we have to skip the section that describes the early holidays, where it describes a Chag HaMatzot, a festival of unleavened bread in the spring, and a Chag HaKatzir, which is a harvest of the first fruits in the summer, and a Chag HaAsif, an ingathering harvest at the end of the year. These are the current holidays of Passover in the spring, and Shavuot in the summer, and Sukkot in the fall, but none of them have the name that we use now. One is Matzah holiday, one is first fruit holiday, and one is gathering holiday. And they don't even have a specific date. They're just seasonal. In the spring you do this, in the summer you do this, in the fall you do that. So it's a very undeveloped, a very agricultural style calendar where it's more about what you need to be doing and not about the specific date, as if you could schedule when the harvest is going to be at its peak. Okay, but we don't have time to dive into the depths of that. What we're going to do instead is jump forward to the beginning of chapter 24. Because you'll notice at the end of chapter 23, and this gets back to that question about who wrote it and how many people wrote it, it says very clearly that you're not allowed to have any covenant with the people you conquer and their gods. You have to drive them out before you. You should not stay in their land because they'd cause you to sin against me, and you will serve their gods. You even have an earlier passage where it says, when you heard my voice, you did not, you don't want any statues, you don't want any images of gods, and you didn't see me, you simply heard me. So in chapter 24, this gets more complicated. So Moses is invited to come up to meet Yahweh with Aaron and Nadav and Avihu, his sons, and the 70 elders of Israel. The others will just come up somewhat close, and Moses will come the closest. And so he tells them all the commands and rules, and all the people answer, yes, we'll do that. So all that previous chapter, the Ten Commandments they all heard, but chapter 21, chapter 22, chapter 23, those are all the laws that God gave to Moses, and now he's repeated them to the people. And they say, we agree. And then he wrote down all the commands of Yahweh. So they were all recorded. He set up an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the tribes. He had some assistants. He took some blood, and he seals the covenant by splashing the blood on all the people. Blech. But, it's a meaningful moment for them. And then in verse 9, Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, his sons, and the 70 elders of Israel went up. And then look at what it says. And they saw the God of Israel. Now, other texts will say, you did not see God. You can't see God. No one can see God and live. And then other passages say, Moses was the one who saw God face to face. Well, what happens here is they see God, but not all of God, and not face to face. They saw the God of Israel. And under his legs, under his feet, was the likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the very sky for purity. So, like they're coming up and he's sitting on the throne, right? And they see like knees down and the floor under him. Very vivid description. But God did not raise his hand up against the leaders of the Israelites. They saw God, it says, literally in the Hebrew. Vayechezu, and they had a vision, envisioned God. Vayochlu vayishtu, and they ate and drank. So he didn't just invite them for a meeting, there was a nosh. He served something to drink and something to eat as well. So now God says to Moses, after the meal, evidently, come up to me on the mountain, and I will give you the stone tablets and the teachings and commandments which I've inscribed to instruct them. Now, an interesting question there. We think of that as the Ten Commandments, right? Because we saw the Charlton Heston movie and the carving out and everything. Or even maybe the Mel Brooks movie where he comes down with 15 commandments and then drops some, and so there's only 10 commandments. But maybe what was intended in this passage, I'm going to give you all these laws, is all these laws that we saw. Seems like a reasonable read to me. So Moses and his attendant Joshua arose. Moses went up to the mountain of God. He said to the elders, wait until we return. You have Aaron and Hur with you. Anyone with a legal matter, approach them. The cloud covered the mountain, and the presence stayed on the mountain and covered it for 6 days. And on the seventh day, God called to Moses from the cloud, and Moses remained on the mountains for 40 days and 40 nights. And that gives you a hint of what's going to happen next, because that's a long time. And the people might begin to wonder, whatever happened to that Moses guy? And that's the beginning of the next story. Now, what's our verdict on this society, this ideal world, this state of nature that's now been defined by laws coming down from a cosmic lawgiver? What's our rating of it? Well, is it just or unjust? Is it a good try for its time and place, but limited by human limitations? Is it disqualified because of certain issues like the treatment of women or slavery or other concerns? Well, when I read this, I see it as an evolutionary ancestor to the society we live in today. You know, an evolutionary ancestor shares some features with you, might have an opposable thumb or an enlarged, frontal cortex for their brain, but it's not going to be identical. And there's going to be parts of it that seem very foreign indeed. That's what this text is. It's an evolutionary ancestor to our ethics and our laws that we experience today. We're proud of some of them. I love the fact that some of these laws, 2,500 years later, still speak profoundly to the human condition and kindness and a just society. And to be honest, I'm not ashamed of the other ones, because as a humanistic Jew, I'm allowed to say, this is wrong. I'm allowed to say, we can do better. I'm allowed to say, my people wrote this a long time ago. I'm so connected to them, even if I disagree. We don't have to say it's all truth, wonderful, and perfect, because our Judaism is not invested in the purity of the text. We exist in a complicated relationship with a complicated past and have an honest take on the reality of then and now. And for what we think is right, we are allowed to say yes or no. So, any last thoughts, comments, questions, reactions?
So, yeah, I have one question. If it's too long, just tell me. But so these laws came down, but I thought Leviticus was like all of the laws. Is that just interpretation of? I'm not
No,
quite sure how they're
there's
related, if
there's
they're
more
related.
laws, and
Okay.
then Numbers has some more laws, and then Deuteronomy retells a lot of the laws, but adds some new laws. And you see, one of the tricky parts about the Torah is that people assume that it's mostly stories because they hear a lot about Genesis and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and his brothers, and they hear about the Exodus at the beginning of Exodus for the first 15 chapters. But large sections of the Torah are laws, laws, and more laws. In fact, the word Torah itself sometimes has the meaning of law. What is the Torah of damages? What is the Torah of leprosy? It'll ask. Now, that could also mean teaching. In modern Hebrew, the word morah is a teacher, same root as Torah. So the Torah also has the concept of teaching, lesson, learning to it. But ultimately, it's largely laws. And so if you read through the text, you get to the end of Exodus, you've still got two-thirds of that Torah scroll left to go. There's going to be a lot of laws in there. And again, you'll like some of them and you may not like other ones of them. They're interesting to consider and to grapple with.
Exodus ones are from God, and the Leviticus and Numbers are from society, or
Well, no, they're all attributed to God,
Okay.
but from our perspective, they were people
Yeah,
attributed to
obviously.
God.
I mean, I'm not.
God says,
Okay, thanks.
and it's a way to get people to listen to you. But our approach is, if people wrote it, then we're allowed to disagree with it.